Winter, 1942, North Atlantic, steel hull temperature, below freezing. A sailor climbs into his rack with nothing but a standard issue wool bedsheet. 8 hours later, he wakes up warm. The man next to him, who folded his sheet differently, spent the night shivering. That difference was not luck, it was physics. Because somewhere between the chaos of convoy duty and the constant threat of U-boat attack, American and British Navy sailors quietly solved one of the most persistent problems of maritime warfare. Not with better heating systems, not with thicker blankets. With a specific, repeatable method of folding a single bedsheet that transformed it from a flat piece of fabric into a functioning thermal trap. A method so effective it survived the entire war, passed from sailor to sailor through berthing compartments on destroyers, cruisers, and cargo ships from the North Sea to the Pacific. We are going to trace exactly how that worked. You will understand why metal ships were uniquely brutal in cold environments, how the physics of body heat and dead air interact, what the actual folding technique involved and why the geometry matters, and how the same principle that kept a sailor alive on a Fletcher-class destroyer in 1943 was later confirmed by thermal engineers studying habitability decades after the war ended. You will also discover why wrapping tighter was the single most common and most deadly mistake. And by the end, you will understand something that contradicts almost everything modern bedding marketing tells you about staying warm. Starting with the ship itself and why sleeping inside a metal hull in cold water is one of the most thermally hostile environments a human body can occupy. If you value documented historical research like this, subscribe. It keeps this work going. Drop a comment with your city. Now, back to the North Atlantic. To understand why the bedsheet trick mattered, you first need to understand what sailors were sleeping inside. A World War II naval vessel was not a building. It was a steel shell floating in water that could be anywhere from 2 degrees Celsius in the North Atlantic to significantly warmer in the Pacific. Steel conducts heat approximately 400 times more efficiently than wood. That means the hull of a destroyer or a cruiser did not buffer the sailors from external temperatures. It transmitted them. Touch the interior bulkhead of a ship operating in North Atlantic winter conditions, and you were touching something close to the temperature of the ocean outside. The air trapped inside the berthing compartments warmed slightly from the collective body heat of the crew, but the metal surfaces surrounding those compartments continuously bled that warmth outward. By 1940, the standard berthing arrangement on most American Navy warships had shifted away from hammocks toward canvas racks on metal frames, stacked 3 high in compartments that might hold 80 men. Royal Navy warships still used hammocks extensively, a practice dating to 1690 when the British Admiralty standardized them fleet-wide. Each sailor received his hammock, a thin mattress, sheets, and 1 or 2 wool blankets. Senior ratings and officers had bunks. Everyone else had a rack or hammock slung from metal bars, surrounded by cold metal walls, in a compartment with minimal heating. Heating on these ships was not central climate control. It was localized and unreliable. Iron stoves, sometimes called hot boxes, could warm a small radius. Berths nearest the stove were informally but fiercely valued. Berths at the far end of a compartment, against the hull, were the coldest. On destroyers like the Fletcher class, space was so constrained that sailors sometimes slept in passageways, at their battle stations, or on deck when weather and operational readiness permitted. During the Battle of Okinawa between April and June of 1945, sailors went 20 to 30 hours without sleep during kamikaze attack sequences, collapsing wherever they could when the threat briefly subsided. This was the environment. Cold metal everywhere. Thin bedding, limited heat sources, bodies that needed to maintain core temperature through an 8-hour sleep cycle, or they would wake degraded, slow, and operationally compromised. And here's the thing that most accounts of wartime naval life skip over entirely. The sailors who figured out how to stay warm were not doing anything exotic. They were applying a principle that thermal science would later quantify precisely. The principle is this: your body generates approximately 100 watts of heat continuously. That is roughly equivalent to a small electric heater. The question is never whether your body produces enough heat. The question is whether your bedding captures it or lets it escape. A flat sheet laid over a body does almost nothing. It sits against the skin, compresses under body weight, and the thin layer of air it might trap is constantly disrupted by movement and lost through the open edges. The warmth the body generates radiates outward and dissipates into the cold air of the compartment. The sailor is warm for perhaps 20 minutes, and then begins to lose the battle against the ambient temperature of the metal box around him. But fold that same sheet in a specific way, and the physics change entirely. The technique that circulated through berthing compartments, documented in sailor accounts and corroborated by the thermal principles later studied in naval habitability research, worked like this. The sheet was not spread flat, it was folded lengthwise, then folded again, creating a dense layered panel. This panel was then used not primarily as a top cover, but as a foundation layer beneath the body, between the sailor and the metal-framed canvas rack. Then the blanket, if available, went on top, but loosely, not tucked tight. The critical insight was that the sheet beneath the body mattered more than the covering above it. This was counterintuitive then, and remains counterintuitive now. We instinctively pile blankets on top. We think of warmth as something that falls down onto us, but heat loss from a sleeping body occurs primarily downward. Into the surface, the body contacts. A cold metal rack with a thin canvas cover will drain heat from a sleeping sailor faster than the cold air above him, because conduction through direct contact is more efficient than convection through air. The folded sheet beneath the body created a compressed but air-trapping barrier between skin and cold surface. 4 layers of wool cotton fabric, each layer holding a thin film of still air, interrupted the conductive path between body and metal. The soldiers who survived the Eastern Front understood the same principle. Accounts from German, Soviet, and Allied forces documented throughout 1942 and 1943 describe men who survived nights at negative 35 degrees Celsius, not because they had more blankets on top, but because they had more insulation beneath them. Pine boughs, straw, folded canvas, anything that broke contact between body and frozen ground. The ground, or in the sailor's case, the rack, was the enemy. The blanket on top was secondary, and there was a second component to the sailor's method, one that addressed the other major failure point of standard bedding in cold environments: moisture. A sleeping human body produces perspiration continuously, even in cold conditions. In a tightly wrapped configuration, that moisture has nowhere to go. It saturates the insulating layer, collapses the air pockets within the fabric, and transforms the blanket from a thermal barrier into a wet compress that accelerates heat loss. Sailors who wrapped their sheets too tightly, who tucked every edge down and sealed themselves in, woke up damp and colder than when they started. The solution was deliberate looseness at the top, combined with density at the bottom. The folded sheet beneath trapped conductive heat. The blanket above sat loosely, allowing moisture vapor to migrate outward while still slowing convective loss. Wool was critical here. Wool retains approximately 80% of its insulating value when damp, a property that synthetic materials of the era could not match. The standard issue wool blankets on Navy ships were not a coincidence. They were the correct material for an environment where some degree of moisture was unavoidable. This is where the geometry of the fold becomes the entire story. The geometry is not complicated, but it is precise, and that precision is exactly why it worked when nothing else did. The fold began at the long edge of the sheet. A standard Navy issue bedsheet measured approximately 72 inches by 90 inches. The sailor took that sheet and folded it lengthwise, bringing one long edge to meet the other. That created a panel 36 inches wide and 90 inches long. Then he folded it lengthwise again, 18 inches wide, 90 inches long. 4 layers of fabric stacked directly on top of each other, each layer separated from the next by a thin film of trapped air. That panel went down first, flat against the canvas rack surface. Then the sailor lay on top of it. This is the moment the physics locked in. Body weight compressed the fabric slightly, but not completely. The 4 layers did not collapse into a single dense slab. They compressed unevenly, with the layers closest to the body bearing the most pressure, and the layers nearest the rack bearing less. That uneven compression created a gradient. The bottom layer, pressed against the cold canvas, still held some air. The middle layers held more. The top layer, directly against the sailor's body, held the most. Each layer acted as a separate thermal break. 4 breaks between skin and cold metal surface. 4 interruptions in the conductive path that would otherwise drain body heat downward into the rack and through the hull into the North Atlantic. The thermal principle at work here has a name: resistance stacking. Each insulating layer adds resistance to heat flow. A single sheet has minimal resistance. 2 layers double it, 4 layers quadruple it. But the relationship is not perfectly linear because each additional layer also reduces convective movement within the air pockets. Still, air does not transfer heat efficiently. Moving air does. 4 compressed layers of fabric created 4 zones of still air that could not circulate, could not carry heat away, could only sit and hold the warmth the body generated downward into them. The naval habitability research that emerged decades after the war, including studies compiled through the Defense Technical Information Center examining berthing conditions on United States Navy ships, confirmed this principle in quantified terms. Temperature regulation in berthing compartments was identified as a primary variable affecting sleep quality and crew effectiveness. The research noted that the surface a sailor slept against mattered as much as the covering above. What the sailors of 1942 had worked out through trial and error in cold berthing compartments on convoy routes between New York and Liverpool, thermal engineers later confirmed with instruments. But the fold itself was only half the system. The other half was what happened at the edges. A sheet folded into an 18-inch panel and laid beneath the body left the sides open. Deliberately, the sailor did not tuck the edges down, did not wrap them under the mattress, left them loose against the rack surface on either side of his body. This created what functions as a passive vapor channel. As body heat built up beneath the sailor and moisture from perspiration migrated downward into the fabric, the open edges allowed that moisture to escape laterally, not upward through the blanket, which would have required the moisture to pass back through the warm zone and potentially condense. Outward, sideways, away from the sleeping body, the blanket on top remained loose for the same reason, loose enough that moisture vapor rising from the body could migrate through the weave and dissipate into the compartment air rather than condensing against the fabric and collapsing the insulating structure. Wool permitted this. The fiber structure of wool, with its natural crimp and scale surface, wicks moisture along the fiber length rather than absorbing it into the core. A wool blanket in a damp environment maintains its loft, maintains its air trapping structure, maintains approximately 80% of its insulating value even when the ambient humidity is high. Cotton alone would have saturated and failed. The wool-cotton blend of the standard Navy sheet combined with the pure wool blanket created a system where moisture was managed rather than trapped. The sailors who got this wrong made one of two errors. They either left the sheet flat, gaining nothing from the fold, and spent the night losing heat downward into the rack, or they wrapped everything too tight, sealed the moisture in, and woke up cold and damp, their insulation compromised by the very heat their bodies had generated. Both errors were common. Both were visible in the difference between a sailor who woke rested and one who woke shivering after the same 8 hours in the same compartment on the same ship. What makes this remarkable is not the complexity. It is the simplicity. No additional equipment, no modification to the ship, no request to the supply chain. One sheet folded twice, placed beneath the body instead of over it, with edges left open and the blanket laid loosely on top. The entire system weighed nothing extra, required nothing extra, and could be executed in under 60 seconds by a sailor climbing into his rack after a 4-hour watch in North Atlantic winter. The knowledge spread the way most practical knowledge spreads in military environments, not through official channels, not through training manuals, through observation. A sailor noticed that the man in the rack above him woke up warm every morning, asked him why, was shown the fold, tried it, it worked, told the next man. The technique moved through berthing compartments on destroyers, cruisers, and Liberty ships across both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters without ever being written down in any official document that has survived. Which raises the question that naval habitability researchers would eventually confront directly. If this worked so reliably, why did it take decades after the war for the underlying physics to be formally studied in the context of shipboard sleeping conditions? The answer to that question is where this story becomes something larger than a bedsheet fold. The answer has everything to do with how military institutions treat informal knowledge, and it exposes a gap between what works and what gets written down that cost sailors unnecessary discomfort for decades after the war ended. Here is the structural problem. The United States Navy in 1942 was not in the business of documenting how enlisted men folded their sheets. It was in the business of winning a war. The Bureau of Ships, which oversaw vessel design and habitability standards during the war years, focused its engineering attention on propulsion, armament, damage control, and structural integrity. Crew comfort existed on the priority list, but it existed near the bottom. A 1942 destroyer commander was not filing reports about which berthing techniques produced the warmest sleep. He was filing reports about fuel consumption, battle readiness, and enemy contact. So the fold lived entirely in the oral tradition of the lower decks, passed from a third-class petty officer to a seaman recruit, demonstrated in the 30 seconds before lights out. Never written, never formalized, never attributed to anyone. It belonged to everyone and to no one. This is not unusual. Military history is dense with survival knowledge that traveled exactly this way. Techniques for waterproofing boots, methods for reducing blisters on long marches, approaches to rationing water in desert conditions. Almost none of it appears in official manuals from the periods when it was most actively practiced. It surfaces decades later in oral histories, in memoirs, in the kind of accounts that historians piece together long after the fact. The Naval History and Heritage Command's Sailor Stories Oral History Collection, which began formally archiving interviews in 2011, contains accounts from veterans whose service stretched back to the Second World War. Within those interviews, references to berthing conditions, sleeping arrangements, and informal adaptations appear repeatedly, not as the primary subject, as background detail. The kind of detail a man mentions in passing because it was simply part of what you did. You folded the sheet, you put it underneath, you left the blanket loose. That was how you slept. It never occurred to anyone that this required explanation because by the time a sailor had been aboard a ship for 2 weeks, he either knew it or he had spent 2 weeks cold. The formal study of shipboard habitability as a quantifiable discipline did not accelerate until the post-war decades, and even then it moved slowly. Naval Sea Systems Command, known as NAVSEA, launched its shipboard habitability improvement program formally in 1999 with the mandate to renovate crew berthing and sanitary spaces across the fleet to meet updated standards under Naval Instruction 9640.1. Ships were inducted into the program 10 years after commissioning. The renovations focused on furniture, fixtures, and deck coverings. Temperature regulation in berthing compartments was identified as a key variable. The research that fed into those standards, compiled in part through the Defense Technical Information Center, confirmed what the sailors of 1942 had already solved empirically. The surface a person sleeps against matters as much as what covers them. Thermal resistance must be built beneath the body, not just above it. That confirmation came roughly 50 years late. A study examining sleep-related habitability issues in berthing spaces on United States Navy ships, drawing on research through 2015, found that environmental conditions including temperature, noise, light, and air quality all affected sleep quality in measurable ways. Sailors with standard rack curtains averaged 5.76 hours of sleep daily. Sailors with enhanced curtains that improved temperature regulation averaged 5.97 hours, a difference of roughly 12 minutes per night, across a 6-month deployment that accumulates. Small margins in sleep quality compound into meaningful differences in cognitive performance, reaction time, and decision-making under stress. 12 minutes. That is what a curtain modification achieved with the full resources of modern naval engineering behind it. The folded sheet achieved something comparable with nothing but the fabric already issued to every sailor aboard. Which raises the question that should sit uncomfortably with anyone who designs systems for human performance. How much knowledge exists right now in the informal oral traditions of people who do difficult things in difficult environments that has never been captured, never been studied, and never been applied at scale? The sailors of 1942 were not scientists. They were not running controlled experiments. They were cold, and they figured out how not to be. The physics they were exploiting, resistance stacking, passive vapor channeling, the thermal priority of the contact surface, those principles were real, and they were consistent. The knowledge just never made it into a document. That gap between practice and documentation is not a small problem. It is the reason the same lesson has to be rediscovered generation after generation in berthing compartments and field camps and anywhere else human beings are asked to sleep in conditions that were not designed for sleep. The fold survived the war. The principle behind it waited decades to be confirmed. And what it tells us about warmth, about insulation, about the specific geometry of how a body loses heat contradicts almost everything the modern bedding industry has built its marketing around, because the industry sells thickness above, more fill power, higher loft, heavier duvets. The sailor's solution was density below, and that difference is not a matter of preference. It is a matter of physics that does not change regardless of what year it is or what a product label claims. That gap between what works and what gets documented did not close when the war ended. It widened, because the sailors who knew the fold came home, left the Navy, and took the knowledge with them into civilian life, where it was simply irrelevant. Nobody folds a bedsheet beneath themselves in a heated bedroom in Ohio in 1946. The technique had no peacetime application, so it faded. Not because it stopped working, because the problem it solved stopped being urgent, but the problem never actually went away. It just moved. The same steel berthing compartments that froze sailors on convoy routes between New York and Liverpool in 1942 were still in service on United States Navy vessels through the 1950s, 60s, and into the 70s. The ships changed. The hull material did not. Steel conducts heat the same way in 1968 as it did in 1942. A sailor aboard the USS Oriskany, a fleet carrier operating in the Gulf of Tonkin between 1966 and 1973, sleeping in a berthing compartment against the hull in cooler waters, was facing the same thermal physics as his predecessor on a Fletcher-class destroyer in the North Atlantic. The fold was the solution then. It remained the solution. But the institutional memory had evaporated. This is where the human cost of the documentation gap becomes concrete, not abstract, concrete. A sailor who spent 2 weeks cold in 1965 was not cold because the problem was unsolvable. He was cold because the solution existed and nobody wrote it down. The knowledge had completed one full generational cycle and vanished. The oral chain broke sometime in the post-war years, in the transition between the men who served and the men who followed them, in the gap between a technique that was obvious to anyone who had learned it and invisible to anyone who had not. The Royal Navy faced an identical problem. Hammocks remained in standard use on British warships into the 1960s, a full 2 decades after the war. The hammock, when used correctly, had its own thermal logic. Wrapped around the body like a cocoon, as described in accounts of 18th century naval life compiled by the American Revolution Institute, a hammock created a natural envelope that trapped body heat on all sides. The sailor was suspended in fabric rather than pressed against a conductive surface. That geometry was thermally superior to a flat rack against a cold bulkhead in one specific way. The hammock had no single cold contact surface beneath the body. The body hung in fabric that curved around it with air circulating beneath. When canvas racks on metal frames replaced hammocks across the American fleet in the early 20th century, That thermal advantage disappeared. The rack was flat. The contact surface was cold. The hammock's passive cocoon effect was gone. Nobody replaced it with anything. The fold was the replacement, but it arrived informally through the lower decks, without any acknowledgement that it was compensating for a design regression. That is the part of this story that naval habitability researchers would eventually find most troubling. The shift from hammock to rack was an administrative and space efficiency decision. It was not a thermal engineering decision. Nobody calculated what the sailors would lose in terms of heat retention when they moved from a suspended cocoon to a flat surface against a metal frame. Nobody designed a compensating system. The sailors designed it themselves, in the berthing compartments, through trial and error in the cold. And then they forgot it. And then they got cold again. And then, 50 years later, researchers at institutions studying shipboard habitability began measuring what the sailors had already solved empirically and lost. The cycle completed. The lesson waited to be relearned. What makes this worth sitting with is not the inefficiency. Institutions are always inefficient with informal knowledge. What makes it worth sitting with is the scale. Tens of thousands of sailors, decades of deployments, unnecessary cold, unnecessary degraded sleep, unnecessary cognitive impairment on watch, all of it downstream from a single failure to write down a fold. The physics were there, the solution was there, the documentation was not. And that brings us to the question that closes this story. Not what the sailors knew, but what we do with the fact that they knew it. So what do we do with it? That is the question this story has been building toward. Not a historical question, a practical one, because the physics have not changed. The body still generates approximately 100 watts of heat. The contact surface still matters more than the covering above, and the fold still works. The principle is simple enough to state in one sentence. Put your insulation beneath you before you put anything on top. That is the entire lesson. 4 layers of fabric between your body and the cold surface beneath you, edges open, blanket loose on top. The sailors of 1942 solved it in under 60 seconds, with nothing but the sheet they were already issued. The solution requires nothing that is not already in front of you. What it requires is knowing to look down instead of up. That inversion, warmth from below rather than warmth from above, runs against every instinct and every piece of bedding marketing produced in the last 80 years. The industry has built its entire commercial logic on loft, on fill power, on the weight of what sits on top of you. A 2025 premium duvet will tell you its insulation value in terms of fill power, thread count, and tog rating. None of those numbers tell you anything about what happens at the contact surface. None of them address the conductive drain that pulls heat downward out of your body and into whatever surface you are lying against. Because solving that problem does not require purchasing anything. It requires a fold. The sailors knew this. They knew it empirically, without instruments, without studies, without any institution telling them it was true. They knew it because they were cold and then they were not cold, and the only variable that changed was the geometry of the fabric beneath them. That knowledge is not gone. It is here in this account, stated plainly. The fold is 2 lengthwise folds of a standard sheet, creating an 18-inch panel, 4 layers thick, placed beneath the body with edges left open and the blanket above laid loose. That is the complete system. It takes less time to execute than it took to describe, and it works on the same physics in your bedroom in 2025 as it worked in a berthing compartment on a Fletcher-class destroyer in 1943. The sailors who figured this out were not exceptional. They were cold, and they were practical, and they paid attention to what worked. The man who woke warm showed the man who woke shivering. The chain moved forward. It broke when the urgency disappeared. It can be rebuilt the same way it was built originally. One person tells another, the knowledge moves. And the next time someone finds themselves in a cold environment with nothing but a sheet and a blanket, they will know exactly what to do with both. There is one final piece of this story that has not been told yet. In January of 2026, a documentary channel examining forgotten WWII survival techniques published a detailed breakdown of the cold weather sleep system used by soldiers on the Eastern Front. The researchers had compiled accounts from German, Soviet, and Allied forces describing what happened when men with identical equipment slept in identical temperatures and woke up with radically different outcomes. The variable was not blanket thickness. It was not clothing. It was the sequence. Men who placed dense folded material beneath their bodies before doing anything else survived nights at negative 35 degrees Celsius that killed men who piled everything on top. The researchers noted something specific. Soldiers who survived described the ground, or whatever surface they were lying against, as the thing they were fighting. Not the air, not the wind. The surface. That language, the surface as the enemy, appears independently in accounts from 3 separate theaters. Men who had never met each other, fighting under 3 different flags, arrived at the same description of the same problem through the same process of being cold, and then figuring out why. The sailor's fold was not a naval invention. It was the same discovery. made in a metal berthing compartment instead of a frozen field, by men who were cold and practical and paying attention to what worked. What that convergence tells us is not complicated. The physics of heat loss from a sleeping human body do not change based on geography or uniform. 100 watts of continuous heat generation, a cold contact surface drawing it downward, and the solution is always the same. Interrupt the conductive path beneath the body before addressing anything above it. That principle was available to anyone who thought about it carefully. The sailors of 1942 thought about it carefully because the North Atlantic gave them no choice. The soldiers on the Eastern Front thought about it carefully because negative 35 degrees gave them no choice. Urgency is a reliable teacher. The lesson it teaches is consistent. What varies is only whether anyone writes it down before the urgency passes, and the knowledge dissolves back into the informal oral tradition where it lived before anyone needed it badly enough to learn it. Winter, 1942, North Atlantic. A sailor climbs into his rack. He folds his sheet twice, lengthwise, lays the panel beneath him, leaves the edges open, puts the blanket loosely on top. 8 hours later, he wakes up warm. That moment is not remarkable because the physics were complicated. It is remarkable because the physics were simple. The solution was available to everyone, and only the men who were cold enough to look down instead of up ever found it. The naval habitability research that confirmed this principle came decades later. The Defense Technical Information Center studies, the NAVS-EA shipboard habitability improvement program launched in 1999, the sleep duration data showing 5.76 hours versus 5.97 hours with improved temperature regulation. All of it arrived 50 years after a sailor on a Fletcher-class destroyer already had the answer. He just never wrote it down. The research is still moving. The Naval History and Heritage Command's Sailor Stories Oral History Collection continues archiving interviews, and within those accounts, the background details of berthing life, the informal adaptations, the things sailors did without thinking because they simply worked are still being recovered. Thermal engineers studying shipboard habitability are still quantifying what informal knowledge already solved. The gap between practice and documentation has not closed. It has only shifted to new environments, new contexts, new generations of people sleeping in cold conditions who have not yet been told to look beneath them first. The standard issue wool bedsheet on a 1942 Navy destroyer weighed approximately 1 pound. Folded twice, it created 4 insulating layers between a sailor's body and a metal rack conducting cold from the North Atlantic. That 1 pound of fabric, arranged correctly, was thermally equivalent to equipment that did not exist yet. The sailors who knew the fold were not better equipped. They were better informed. Those are not the same thing. There is one final piece of this story that has not been told yet. In January of 2026, a documentary channel examining forgotten WWII survival techniques published a detailed breakdown of the cold weather sleep system used by soldiers on the Eastern Front. The researchers had compiled accounts from German, Soviet, and Allied forces describing what happened when men with identical equipment slept in identical temperatures and woke up with radically different outcomes. The variable was not blanket thickness. It was not clothing. It was the sequence. Men who placed dense, folded material beneath their bodies before doing anything else survived nights at negative 35 degrees Celsius that killed men who piled everything on top. The researchers noted something specific. Soldiers who survived described the ground, or whatever surface they were lying against, as the thing they were fighting. Not the air, not the wind, the surface. That language, the surface as the enemy, appears independently in accounts from 3 separate theaters. Men who had never met each other, fighting under 3 different flags, arrived at the same description of the same problem through the same process of being cold and then figuring out why. The sailor's fold was not a naval invention. It was the same discovery, made in a metal berthing compartment instead of a frozen field, by men who were cold and practical and paying attention to what worked. What those Eastern Front accounts also revealed, and what the documentary researchers found most striking, was the degree to which soldiers had independently quantified the problem in practical terms before any instrument confirmed it. German accounts from the winter campaigns of 1941 and 1942 describe soldiers building sleeping platforms from pine branches, stacked 8 to 12 inches thick when the material was available. Not because anyone told them a specific thickness, because they had tested thinner platforms and woken cold, and thicker ones and woken warm, and the threshold somewhere between 2 and 4 inches of compressed insulation was where the difference became reliable. Soviet accounts from the same period describe a nearly identical threshold discovered through the same process. 2 armies on opposite sides of the same front, fighting each other by day, arrived at the same insulation depth by night through independent trial and error. The number was not in any manual. It was in the ground beneath them, legible only to the men who were cold enough to read it. On a naval vessel, and that same threshold translated directly to the 4 compressed layers of a twice-folded sheet, not 8 inches of pine boughs. But the same principle. Scaled to the materials available in a berthing compartment on a ship moving at 27 knots through the North Atlantic, the platform was different, the physics were identical, and in both cases, the men who built the platform correctly woke up. The men who did not sometimes did not wake up at all. There was one additional technique that circulated in parallel with the fold, documented in berthing accounts from Liberty ships and cargo vessels rather than warships, where the watch rotations were different and the cold exposure was often longer. On merchant vessels crossing the North Atlantic in convoy, sailors sometimes combined the folded sheet beneath the body with a secondary adaptation borrowed from the same fieldcraft logic that soldiers used on land. A canvas poncho, an oilcloth, or in some cases, simply a second piece of heavy fabric was laid directly against the rack surface before the folded sheet went down. Not for warmth, for vapor. The canvas layer acted as a barrier between the cold metal rack and the insulating sheet, interrupting not just the conductive path, but also the moisture transfer that occurred when warm, humid air from the sleeping body contacted the cold rack surface and condensed. Without that barrier, the bottom layer of the folded sheet would gradually absorb condensation from below, collapsing its air pockets from the rack side rather than from the body side. The canvas barrier kept the sheet dry from beneath, while the open lateral edges kept it dry from above. The result was an insulating layer that maintained its structure through an entire 8-hour sleep cycle, rather than degrading in the second half of the night as moisture accumulated. Merchant sailors who used this 3-layer system, canvas against the rack, folded sheet on top, loose blanket above, reported consistently warmer sleep than those who used only the fold. The addition cost nothing. It required only the awareness that moisture moved in 2 directions simultaneously, and that both directions needed to be managed. What that convergence tells us is not complicated. The physics of heat loss from a sleeping human body do not change based on geography or uniform. 100 watts of continuous heat generation, a cold contact surface drawing it downward, and the solution is always the same. Interrupt the conductive path beneath the body before addressing anything above it. That principle was available to anyone who thought about it carefully. The sailors of 1942 thought about it carefully because the North Atlantic gave them no choice. The soldiers on the Eastern Front thought about it carefully because negative 35 degrees gave them no choice. Urgency is a reliable teacher. The lesson it teaches is consistent. What varies is only whether anyone writes it down before the urgency passes, and the knowledge dissolves back into the informal oral tradition where it lived before anyone needed it badly enough to learn it. Winter, 1942, North Atlantic. A sailor climbs into his rack. He folds his sheet twice, lengthwise, lays the panel beneath him, leaves the edges open, puts the blanket loosely on top. 8 hours later, he wakes up warm. That moment is not remarkable because the physics were complicated. It is remarkable because the physics were simple. The solution was available to everyone, and only the men who were cold enough to look down instead of up ever found it. The naval habitability research that confirmed this principle came decades later. The Defense Technical Information Center studies, the NAVS-EA shipboard habitability improvement program launched in 1999, the sleep duration data showing 5.76 hours versus 5.97 hours with improved temperature regulation. All of it arrived 50 years after a sailor on a Fletcher-class destroyer already had the answer. He just never wrote it down. The research is still moving. The Naval History and Heritage Command's Sailor Stories Oral History collection continues archiving interviews, and within those accounts, the background details of berthing life, the informal adaptations, the things sailors did without thinking because they simply worked are still being recovered. Thermal engineers studying shipboard habitability are still quantifying what informal knowledge already solved. The gap between practice and documentation has not closed. It has only shifted to new environments, new contexts, new generations of people sleeping in cold conditions who have not yet been told to look beneath them first. The standard issue wool bedsheet on a 1942 Navy destroyer weighed approximately 1 pound. Folded twice, it created 4 insulating layers between a sailor's body and a metal rack conducting cold from the North Atlantic. That 1 pound of fabric, arranged correctly, was thermally equivalent to equipment that did not exist yet. The sailors who knew the fold were not better equipped. They were better informed. Those are not the same thing.